Welcome everyone. Before we start, please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Also leave a like to the video. Thanks. Let's get to it. The man at the front of the courtroom looked nothing like the monster people had imagined. His grey hair was trimmed neatly. His glasses sat square on his face. He spoke softly, politely, as if giving a church testimony. But the words coming from his mouth described the details of murders so cruel that some jurors averted their eyes. Without emotion, he explained how he had bound, tortured, and killed 10 people over 3 decades. The tone never changed. Each killing was catalogued, each step a routine. Behind him, in the gallery, sat his wife, his grown children, and members of his church congregation. The same congregation that had voted him in as their council president. They had known him as Dennis Rader, volunteer dog catcher, Air Force veteran, code enforcement officer, and devout Lutheran. When one of the prosecutors asked him to confirm his identity, he said it plainly. "Yes, sir. Dennis Lynn Rader, also known as BTK." Gasps rippled across the room. For 30 years, BTK, short for bind, torture, kill, had been a ghost story in Wichita. Parents whispered his name when warning their kids to lock the doors. Police had followed hundreds of leads, often chasing shadows. And now, the unassuming man in a courthouse suit calmly admitted it was him all along. In that instant, the city's longest nightmare collided with the life of one of its most ordinary citizens. Neighbors who had borrowed his tools sat stunned. His co-workers from the security company could not believe the news. His pastor could not find the words. The revelation posed a disturbing question. How does someone live 2 completely separate lives without ever slipping? For 3 decades, Dennis Rader coached Boy Scouts and led prayers, yet at the same time stalked, photographed, and murdered strangers for what he called projects. The prosecution team listened to his confession with disbelief. Detectives who had once worked the cold case hung their heads. He spoke like a man describing yard work, not murder. But what puzzled everyone most was not how he killed, it was how he managed to stop and stay invisible for 25 years. When the judge asked if he understood the consequences of pleading guilty, Rader nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, "I did it." That quiet admission ended 30 years of speculation. But to understand how an ordinary man fooled an entire city and all the investigators hunting him, we have to go back to the beginning. Wichita, Kansas. January 1974. That is where it all started. In the early 1970s, Wichita was a city that seemed safe. Families left their doors unlocked. Neighborhood kids wandered freely on bicycles through tree-lined streets. It was a place defined by wheat fields, church potlucks, and routine. The kind of city that believed bad things happened somewhere else. Then, in the winter of 1974, that illusion shattered. On the morning of January 15th, a family of 4 was found dead inside a small white house on East Edgemore Street. Joseph Otero, a retired Air Force man, his wife, Julie, and their 2 young children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, had been strangled. The crime scene was meticulous, almost ritualistic. There were no signs of forced entry, no usable fingerprints. Whoever did it had taken his time. Detectives arriving at the Otero home would later say it was the most disturbing scene they had ever witnessed. Each victim had been bound with cord in a precise way. A radio had been moved, curtains carefully closed. The killer had even taken souvenirs, a few small items gone missing, including a wristwatch and a driver's license. For Wichita police, it seemed unexplainable. There was no robbery, no arson, no clear motive. Investigators checked family connections and grudges, assuming someone close must be responsible. But the truth was far stranger. The Oteros had been chosen by a man they did not know, at random. After being watched for weeks, word spread quickly. Newspapers struggled with what to print. By dinner that same day, every household in town was talking about the Otero murders. People double-checked locks. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. The friendly, trusting energy of the city began to twist into unease. Detective Ken Landwehr, then early in his career, remembered how fear rippled outward. Police had no precedent for something like this. The crimes looked planned, organized, committed by someone who understood police procedures and intentionally left red herrings. At that point, Wichita had never dealt with a serial killer, though no one yet dared use the term. 2 months later, in April, another murder. A young woman named Catherine Bright was found in her home, stabbed and strangled. Her brother, who survived an attack, described a calm stranger who tied them up before striking. Again, the knot styles matched the Otero crime. Still, no clear suspect. The killer wanted to be known, though not caught. He watched the news coverage closely, disappointed by how quickly it faded. That same year, a typed letter arrived at a local TV station, supposedly from the killer himself. It contained graphic details from inside the Otero home that only the murderer could know. In it, he wrote the 3 words that would define him: bind, torture, kill. The signature, BTK Strangler, seared itself into local memory. Wichita had a name for its terror now, though no face. Soon, the police department was flooded with tips, confessions, and false claims. Every lead ended in frustration. Officers were exhausted, and citizens organized neighborhood watches. Parents forbade daughters from walking alone after sunset. Newspaper editorials debated what kind of person would write to the media about his own crimes. A psychopath? A mastermind? No one could decide. The letter was both arrogant and strangely formal, filled with grammar corrections and lists. It sounded like someone who valued control, someone who believed himself more clever than everyone else. Meanwhile, the killer's life continued unnoticed. He worked quietly, attended community events, and waved to neighbors. When police set up a task force, they circulated sketches. None looked remotely like him. Major crimes detectives compared similar cases in neighboring counties, but found only dead ends. By late 1974, close to 1,000 suspects had been questioned. Still nothing. The city's fear deepened into paranoia. Locksmith companies thrived. Gun sales spiked. And yet the police remained one crucial step behind, not realizing the killer lived among the very people he terrified. Wichita changed during those months. The quiet streets gained new rituals. Parents escorting kids to bus stops. People keeping porch lights on all night. Rumors spread faster than facts. When another anonymous note arrived at the Wichita Eagle a year later, listing potential future victims, the city's nerves snapped. Inside police headquarters, meetings stretched late into the night. Officers studied maps, marking possible stalking zones. Scholars of criminal behavior, still a developing field, were consulted to build a profile. They concluded that BTK was organized, compulsive, possibly married with a steady job, someone who maintained a facade of normalcy. They believed he was likely a white male, meticulous, socially competent, and craving recognition. That assessment was chillingly accurate. But without forensics to match evidence, it remained theory. For the next few years, the investigation expanded in waves. Every few months, a new letter or a new murder rekindled panic. In 1977, 2 more women, Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, were killed in similar ways. In one call to police after Nancy Fox's death, the killer himself reported the crime, his tone methodical and calm. A recording of that voice would haunt detectives for decades. The community's fear turned into resignation. People understood now that the killer could strike anywhere, at any time. BTK was not targeting a type. His victims spanned ages and backgrounds. That randomness made him unstoppable. Officers drove past potential suspect houses with uneasy tension, waiting for a mistake. But BTK did not make mistakes. At least, not yet. Each crime was carefully orchestrated, rehearsed in his mind for weeks before execution. Unknown to them, he kept trophies in secret. A necklace, a Polaroid, a word typed on an index card. Crimes that began as fantasy had evolved into ritual. Bound victims, precise knots, and tape. Everything catalogued like part of a file system. The working group on the case, now called the BTK Task Force, grew larger than any previous investigation in the city's history. They compared footprints, checked handwriting, traced stolen items, and still, every clue seemed to fade. Retired sergeants later remarked how the killer always seemed to know the limits of police technology. Wichita, in the 1970s, lacked DNA tools, computer databases, or digital record sharing. BTK exploited that fully, vanishing after each act. Meanwhile, reporters faced their own dilemma. Covering the case risked glamorizing the killer, but staying silent risked angering him, which might drive him to kill again. Newspapers balanced caution with public safety, printing his letters only partially. Every message dripped with taunts, as if mocking both media and police for their helplessness. By the end of the decade, BTK had become a haunting local folklore, discussed reluctantly but never forgotten. The fear he left behind seeped into daily life. People lived differently, trusted less, moved through their neighborhoods with a quiet sense of watching and being watched. And somewhere within those very neighborhoods, Dennis Rader smiled politely at his neighbors, mowed his lawn, attended church on Sundays, and planned his next project. While police scoured the dark corners of Wichita, the killer was hiding in plain sight, driving carpools, taking family pictures, and making small talk at grocery stores. They were looking for a shadow. They did not realize the shadow looked just like them. That misunderstanding would sustain his illusion for 3 decades, as the city tried to live normally beneath the weight of a phantom. And for Dennis Rader, ordinary life was the perfect disguise. Dennis Rader blended into Wichita so effortlessly that even his closest friends would later wonder how they had missed the signs. He lived in the suburb of Park City, a quiet, middle-class community just north of town. On paper, his life was ordinary, methodical and unremarkable, just the way he wanted it to look. He had served in the United States Air Force after high school, stationed in Japan and on remote bases where discipline and order were prized. When he returned home in the early 1970s, he married his college sweetheart, Paula, a woman described by neighbors as warm and trusting. Together they started a family and built the kind of stable life most people aspired to. Rader earned a degree in criminal justice at Wichita State University, a choice that seemed logical for someone interested in public service. But for him, it was more than career training. It was reconnaissance. He studied police methods and evidence handling, taking note of weaknesses in procedure. Professors remembered him as serious and rule-bound, a man who corrected others' grammar in class and obsessed over structure. That precision came to define him. Friends later recalled that even his handwriting looked engineered. Around that time, he began work at ADT Security Services, installing alarm systems across Wichita. It was the late 1970s, and fear of BTK had made home security a booming business. Customers hired him because they were scared of the killer. Rader reassured them with professionalism and expertise, carefully checking locks and sensors. Few could imagine that the man protecting their homes was the very predator who had driven them to buy alarms in the first place. The irony was twisted but perfect. He could survey potential targets with legitimate access, all while feeding the image of a helpful neighbor. At home, Rader projected control. He demanded order from his children and kept strict routines. Dinner was served at the same time each evening. The yard had to be trimmed precisely, and minor rule breaking in the household led to stern lectures. He taught Sunday school, volunteered as a scout leader, and never missed a church service. To his congregation at Christ Lutheran Church, he was dependable, organized to a fault, sometimes intense, but generous with time and effort. When positions opened on the church council, Rader was the natural choice for president. He accepted with calm humility. No one suspected that the meticulous record-keeping he prided himself on mirrored the documentation of his crimes. Behind closed doors, his need for control metastasized into obsession. He kept detailed notes on people he found interesting, especially women who resembled the victims from his fantasies. He called these notes his studies, listing schedules, addresses, and habits. To anyone else, they would have looked like mundane clerical work. To him, they were blueprints for potential projects. Long before he acted again, he rehearsed scenarios privately, constructing elaborate rituals and photographing himself in disguises. Investigators would later find those images stored carefully, labeled like case files. Rader's inner world revolved around secrecy and dominance. He often felt invisible in daily life, a man whose public good manners masked private frustration. The killings brought him what he considered recognition and power, yet he disliked chaos. Every act followed plans drafted weeks in advance. He even tested knots and bindings on himself to ensure efficiency. His victims, he would later say, became subjects of study, language that reduced human suffering to the satisfaction of an academic experiment. Co-workers at ADT described him as dependable and quietly strict, the kind of employee who documented every appointment. He memorized alarm codes and layouts. Occasionally he would correct clients about their paperwork, earning a reputation as detail-oriented. Nothing appeared unusual until looking back, when coincidences multiplied. Houses he serviced that later turned out to be within walking distance of crime scenes. Notes about female clients who fitted his preferred type. But at the time, the overlap seemed meaningless. He was trustworthy, polite, and, above all, normal. The late 1970s into the early 1980s saw Rader solidify his standing as a citizen. He joined community committees, sponsored neighborhood cleanups, and wrote small notices for the church newsletter. That visibility worked as camouflage. When someone holds a clipboard and wears a smile, people rarely question their intentions. It was a tactic he had perfected, using authority as a shield. Years later, former neighbors recalled small anecdotes that now feel chilling. Rader reminding others about lawn ordinances, citing municipal codes, or pacing property lines with a tape measure. At the time, it read as civic pride. In hindsight, it was a preview of the authoritarian side that defined both his day job and his darker life. His job at the city as a compliance officer further satisfied that need for dominance. Residents complained he issued warnings with unnecessary zeal, photographing violations and quoting regulations verbatim. One former homeowner remembered how Rader once threatened citation over weeds and then quietly inspected the property after sunset. To his supervisors, he was dedicated. To those he cited, he was intimidating. This role blurred boundaries between lawful enforcement and personal thrill, extending his private compulsion for control into legitimate power. Within the family, his rigidity caused tension. He expected obedience and silence about private matters. To outsiders, the Rader household embodied moral rectitude, church outings, scout meetings, a tidy home. But Paula occasionally felt unnerved by his intensity, though she could never articulate why. When he traveled for work, he carried notebooks that she assumed were filled with service records. In reality, they were sketches and fantasies organized the same way he catalogued municipal infractions. Throughout the 1980s, communication from BTK faded. Police started to believe he was dead, jailed, or moved away. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader thrived under anonymity. With every year of silence, he convinced himself his secret life had been perfectly compartmentalized. The mask had hardened into his identity. He told himself that phase was behind him, that he was now a respectable man devoted to family and church. But the compulsion never disappeared. It simmered beneath routines, awake in his mind during sermons, flickering through thoughts as he measured grass height for his next citation. He kept mementos hidden, occasionally taking them out to relive moments in solitude. They served as proof of superiority, reminders that he had fooled everyone. What made Rader so difficult to spot was the absence of extremes. He was not overtly eccentric, violent, or socially withdrawn. His blandness became armor. In conversations, he asked polite questions, took interest in others' schedules, and retained information with unnerving precision. Neighbors trusted him with spare keys while on vacation. Small requests like that reinforced his illusion of responsibility. Ironically, he derived reassurance from being trusted. It mirrored his own self-image as protector and enforcer. That duality, guardian and predator, fueled a steady sense of control that kept him functional. Behind the neat exterior, fantasies resurfaced through writing. He composed short stories about abduction and bondage, often inserting coded initials referencing past victims. The writing process mirrored his methodical planning, typed, edited, and stored in folders. None of these pieces left the house. They were both journal and confession, his private archive of control. Years later, detectives would find them stored alongside hit lists and self-portraits, each representing the tension between the ordinary man and the hidden predator. By the early 1990s, Rader had become a fixture in Park City's civic life. His children left for college, and he channeled energy into church leadership. He ran meetings according to strict parliamentary rules, recording every motion and attendance detail. The congregation appreciated his precision. They did not realize it mirrored the same meticulousness he once applied when cataloguing victims. His sense of order had simply migrated from crime scenes to committee rooms. For all appearances, Dennis Rader was an upstanding family man who valued discipline and public virtue. And as Wichita gradually healed from its years of fear, he walked among them, the quiet embodiment of normalcy. But under that calm exterior, the same craving for attention that once drove BTK was stirring again. The newspaper headlines had long since faded, and the city barely spoke of him. To a man who believed control was recognition, silence felt intolerable. Soon, that hunger would drive him to break his own rule of invisibility, because the man who once vowed never to write again, the man whose bland routines kept him safe, could not stand being forgotten, and when he reached out to the media once more, it would mark the beginning of his downfall. By the late 1970s, Dennis Rader's quiet life and the police department's frustration existed in parallel. The city had begun to heal, yet the man responsible for its deepest wounds was still there, moving through ordinary days. For a time, his crimes stayed private, locked away in memory, photographed, and documented only for himself. But the longer the silence stretched, the more it bothered him. BTK was not just a killer. He was a man obsessed with acknowledgement. Being unknown felt like being invisible. And invisibility to Rader was intolerable. He followed news reports on unsolved crimes, scanning for mentions of BTK. When the coverage faded, he took it personally. His identity as a father, church leader, and compliance officer gave him respect, but none of it satisfied the ego behind the mask. What he wanted was confirmation that the world remembered him. Without that, his sense of superiority, his belief that he controlled the narrative, began to crack. In October 1977, not long after the murder of Nancy Fox, the killer's voice returned in the form of another letter, dropped into a typewriter and mailed to a local television station. The tone was formal, almost bureaucratic, like an internal memo written by a man taking inventory. He corrected the press for calling him the Strangler, insisting that his true designation was BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them. Each phrase was clinically spaced, reminiscent of a police report. There was no flourish or slang, only precision. Inside police headquarters, the letter was studied word by word. Detectives had a strong sense that they were hearing from someone who saw himself as methodical and intellectual. Linguistic analysts noticed his phrasing suggested a person educated, rule-oriented, and possibly working in an administrative role. But there was no direct clue to identity, no fingerprints, no DNA, just words. Still, the city now had a living reminder that BTK had not disappeared. His message was clear: I'm still here. That re-emergence reignited fear. The press struggled again with how to cover the letters responsibly. Publishing too much risked giving BTK the fame he wanted. Publishing too little risked provoking him further. The Wichita Eagle opted for partial prints, omitting several paragraphs that contained explicit threats. Yet those omissions did not matter to Rader. What mattered was seeing his chosen name in bold print. It was proof of existence, the validation of a performance. Over the next couple of years, he continued writing sporadically. Each new message arrived with meticulous formatting and references to other famous killers, like Son of Sam and Jack the Ripper. He compared himself not just to monsters but to professionals, men of discipline who executed their work with purpose. It was as if he viewed murder as an art form that required documentation. One letter even mimicked the structure of a university thesis, complete with numbered sections and lists. Detectives noticed another pattern. BTK seemed to crave both audience and control. He wanted attention, but on his terms. In one note, he criticized police for suggesting he might have died or fled the area. In another, he listed potential victims as if teasing future projects. Yet many of these were people he had only fantasized about. The letters gave police the illusion of progress while actually leading them nowhere. Every clue chased turned into a loop, every sentence ending in ambiguity. Reporters who saw the letters up close described the language as chillingly sterile, stripped of emotion. Phrases like subject secured or project completed sounded more like business memos than the boasts of a killer. That detachment mirrored his public demeanor perfectly. The polite man who followed church bylaws to the letter, who filled out municipal forms in triplicate, who viewed rules as sacred. To Rader, rules were a comfort even while breaking the ultimate one. For the Wichita community, BTK's written words were more invasive than his crimes. Murders could be mourned. Letters reminded them he was still among them. Each time a new envelope appeared, radio stations broke into programming to report it. Schools increased safety drills. The panic had context now, not just the act, but the mind behind it. One investigative journalist later explained that covering BTK was like being played by the killer himself. He provided them just enough information to guarantee coverage, but withheld anything that could expose him. And underneath every line lay the same need, to remind the city that he alone dictated when the terror began and when it paused. After the Fox murder, BTK slipped away again. Months passed, then years. Letters stopped. Murders stopped. The task force disbanded. The city exhaled. Detectives moved to other departments or retired. But for Rader, stopping was not reform, it was strategy. He had achieved what he wanted. Anonymity restored, yet legacy secured. Throughout the 1980s, criminology experts revisited the case occasionally, interpreting his correspondence as a form of narcissistic maintenance, a way of ensuring self-importance without direct risk. Forensic psychologists describe such killers as communication-driven predators, those who experience satisfaction from media coverage as much as from the crimes themselves. Rader fit that description perfectly. At home, he sometimes reread copies of his old letters, reliving the attention they once brought. He even corrected typos with a pen, unable to tolerate imperfection. The grammar police persona that his co-workers found tedious at ADT was part of the same compulsion that drove BTK to perfect his public image. Police archives filled with his communications grew thick, and analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Behavioral Science Unit began noting peculiar consistencies. They determined that BTK's writing style contained markers of middle-aged, educated men with structured daily routines, someone bound to duties or family obligations. If such a profile had existed in the late 1970s, it might have narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. But by then, Rader's life as a father of two and a soon-to-be church leader fit that profile too perfectly to draw suspicion. As media attention shifted to other crimes across the country, BTK's story faded from headlines. Wichita slowly reclaimed a sense of normalcy. Children grew up without hearing the name whispered at dinner tables. Teenagers who had been infants during the terror graduated and left for college. In Rader's mind, this erasure was unacceptable. He needed his narrative revived, but circumstances and aging kept him cautious. Even so, the pattern of control never dissolved. Occasionally, Rader drafted unsent letters during sleepless nights, critiquing old newspaper coverage or suggesting that if BTK were ever caught, it would be due to arrogance, not evidence. The irony of that statement lingered in his private notebooks for years, long before it would prove prophetic. By the end of the 1980s, the communications ceased completely. Officially, investigators declared BTK inactive. Unofficially, detectives like Ken Landwehr still kept boxes of files under their desks. They never really believed such a methodical man could just stop. He had stopped, but not by choice. Rader had grown comfortable inside the life he had created. A father, homeowner, and moral authority who attended city council meetings, yet every newspaper anniversary, every retrospective article reminding Wichita of its unsolved case, stirred the ego again. Somewhere deep down, he knew he would eventually reach out. The story of BTK was incomplete without an audience, and Dennis Rader had never been good at staying silent. As the 1980s slipped into the 1990s, the world moved toward computers, digital storage, and early internet forums. Rader watched quietly, fascinated by the new ways information could be shared. He understood that communication had evolved, but the impulse behind it had not changed. Whether ink or floppy disk, he still believed he could control the message. For 25 years, he would manage that silence, keeping the legend alive in isolation. But when he resurfaced decades later, through a simple package sent to a local news station, the cat-and-mouse game reignited, one that would finally expose him. Before that, though, Wichita would endure decades of haunting uncertainty, knowing BTK might be gone but never gone for good. And for Dennis Rader, fading attention was not peace, it was punishment. In early 2004, Wichita's oldest nightmare came back to life. The newsroom at KAKE-TV received a small manila envelope with no return address. Inside were photocopies of old crime scene photographs, a word puzzle, and a photocopy of a driver's license that matched one stolen from a BTK victim decades earlier. The letter was signed simply BTK. At first, producers thought it was a prank, until detectives confirmed the items were authentic. They had been missing since the Fox murder in 1977. After 25 quiet years, the serial killer had returned. The timing was not random. Just months earlier, the Wichita Eagle had published its anniversary piece on the Otero case. Rader had clipped it carefully, annoyed that journalists seemed to treat BTK as part of remote history. Now he wanted to prove he was still around and still smarter than everyone searching for him. The envelope's contents showed the same obsessive precision as before, typed lines, numbered references, and calculations describing how long victims had struggled. To detectives, it was like receiving a time capsule from the city's darkest era. Within hours, Police Chief Norman Williams called an emergency meeting. Officers who had never worked the original case gathered beside veterans who knew every detail by heart. The first step was verification, and once the stolen license matched police evidence, the grim truth settled in. BTK had not died or disappeared. He had been living somewhere nearby, quietly watching the city forget him. News coverage reignited immediately. Television anchors, some of whom had been children during the 1970s, reported on the development with disbelief. Residents phoned tip lines by the hundreds, describing suspicious neighbors or recalling strange encounters from decades earlier. For investigators, the chatter felt like déjà vu. The same dread spread across Wichita as doors locked, porch lights burned late, and the Phantom's name once again filled headlines. But this time, police had new tools. DNA analysis could now detect microscopic traces that had long been invisible. The task force that reformed around the BTK communication included specialists in digital forensics and data management. They catalogued every archived sample from the Otero, Fox, and Bright scenes. For the first time, officers believed technology might do what legwork never could. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader followed the coverage closely from his Park City home. He watched television reports at night, quietly pleased. The tone of respect, mixed with fear, was exactly what he wanted. 15 minutes of news fame restored the identity he had suppressed for decades. The next package he prepared was more elaborate. A cereal box decorated with hand-drawn symbols containing a doll positioned like one of his victims. He left it at a local Home Depot parking lot, confident the police would find it. They did. Inside were clues referencing previous murders and another cryptic message promising more to come. Detectives analyzed every item for DNA, but Rader's caution held. He used gloves, avoided stamps that required saliva, and sealed envelopes manually. For investigators, it was frustratingly familiar. He seemed to know their process almost too well. Theories circulated that BTK was either law enforcement, retired military, or someone who had studied criminal investigations. They were closer than they realized. As packages continued arriving through 2004, the pattern revealed more about the sender's psychology. Between boasts and puzzles, he asked strange questions, testing boundaries and searching for reassurance. One message included a request for feedback, as though he were corresponding with colleagues on a project. He wanted acknowledgement that police were reading, engaging, and most importantly, respecting him. That craving, stronger than fear of discovery, was about to expose him. Chief Williams authorized detectives to respond indirectly through public statements. Press conferences hinted that police were open to communication but avoided direct promises. The plan worked. The killer sent more. Each new message tightened the circle. One arrived inside a post office drop box, wrapped in a garbage bag. Another appeared under a deadline day newspaper rack downtown. None contained fingerprints, but consistent typing errors and phrasing established a clear linguistic pattern. Forensic linguists began mapping those patterns, comparing them with local publications, online forums, and even church newsletters. Detectives also noticed how modern technology fascinated the writer. In several notes, he referenced computer disks, commenting on their convenience and secrecy. He wondered aloud whether electronic files could be traced. To the FBI team assisting, that curiosity was a gift. They planned to let him believe whatever they needed him to believe. While police reconstructed traps, Rader continued living normally. He chaired church meetings, wrote agenda notes, and lectured Boy Scouts on responsibility. No one near him suspected he was composing coded letters between civic duties. His wife noticed none of the extra errands, and his co-workers dismissed his muttered jokes about serial killers as dark humor. The double life resumed effortlessly. But unlike in the 1970s, his communications now left digital footprints, invisible but traceable. Each new package toyed with investigators, photographs, poems, and crossword teasers. One included a sketch titled, "The Sexual Thrill is My Truth," signed BTK. Another contained a list of possible next targets, though none of those people existed. The illusion of control thrilled him. Detectives interpreted it differently. They were dealing with an aging man whose ego was fighting irrelevance, desperate to relive past notoriety. That insight helped shape their counter-strategy. The task force monitored local printing stores, library computers, and office supply shops. Surveillance footage was reviewed for anyone using public copy machines repeatedly within short timeframes. Tip lines reopened, and one caller mentioned a man named Dennis, who frequently boasted about knowing detailed stories of the BTK case. It was noted, but seemed too vague to act on. Still, as 2004 turned into 2005, the packages kept coming, and their content betrayed subtle carelessness. Each one displayed a slightly updated home printer font, suggesting newer equipment. Investigators concluded the killer had adopted modern technology, but did not fully understand how traceable it could be. Detectives decided to coax him into using something electronic, something that would store metadata. That opportunity came when Rader sent a message asking whether a floppy disk could be used safely. He wrote, "If I send one, will it be traceable? Be honest." The police responded publicly through a newspaper column, assuring him the disk would be untraceable. It was a deliberate trap. They hoped his need for attention would override caution. Before sending it, Rader planned the delivery on paper, calculating routes and times like a reconnaissance mission. He wore gloves, sealed the disk in a single envelope, and mailed it from downtown Wichita like any other piece of correspondence. Then he waited, proud of his modern touch. When no arrest came immediately, he relaxed. That act of pride would mark the beginning of his collapse. Meanwhile, detectives at the lab studied every previous communication, confident the killer's arrogance would soon betray him. Chief Williams reminded his team daily that after 30 years of loss and fear, the city deserved closure. "We'll get him this time," he said. and for the first time, even skeptics believed it. Rader, sitting in his tidy Park City office, watched the evening news smiling faintly. When reporters described BTK's intelligence and longevity, he nodded, savouring the validation. He had given the police a puzzle, and so far, they had not solved it. What he did not realise was that the clue unlocking 30 years of horror already sat in their evidence room, a simple floppy disk, carrying a ghost's digital fingerprint, waiting to expose the man who thought he could never be traced. The city did not know it yet, but the countdown to his arrest had already begun. February 2005 began like any other winter month in Wichita, with cold winds, short days, and a lingering sense of routine. For Dennis Rader, that routine included preparing another communication for the police. He believed the correspondence would cement his reputation as a master of the game, the unseen puppeteer who dictated both the killings and the investigation. When he asked through a previous message whether a floppy disk could be traced, he expected honesty. The police had publicly assured him that it could not. That assurance, a calculated deception, was exactly what he needed to let down his guard. Inside his small home office in Park City, Rader drafted a letter on his computer, addressed to the police. He typed with deliberate formality, the same tone that permeated all his communications. Each sentence bore traces of his peculiar obsession with order, with dates, project numbers, and even bullet points describing his satisfaction with the renewed attention. Then he saved the document on a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk, careful not to leave fingerprints. To him, the disk represented modernization, proof that BTK could evolve. He mailed the package from a downtown post office, feeling both anxious and triumphant. The next day, it reached a local television station, which turned it over to authorities. Detectives immediately sent it to the Computer Crimes Division of the Wichita Police Department. Within hours, a specialist inserted the disk into a secure system. On it were a message, a few random images, and one file labeled Tester RTF. The file seemed harmless, a simple text note signed by BTK. But when investigators viewed its metadata, a hidden line of information appeared. The document had been last edited by Dennis on a computer belonging to Christ Lutheran Church. The discovery sent a jolt through the task force room. For 30 years they had chased shadows. Now they had a first name and a location. Detectives cross-referenced every Dennis affiliated with Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. Only one fit the demographic profile they had built. Middle-aged, meticulous, employed in administrative work. His name was Dennis Rader. One investigator recalled the moment vividly. It was like the wind stopped in the room, he said. The team printed the metadata and passed it quietly among themselves. After decades of dead ends, the answer had been sitting a few miles north of the city centre, living as a church president and city compliance officer. Cautiously, they began surveillance. Plainclothes officers parked near Rader's modest beige house. They tracked his routine: morning coffee, commute to the city office, church meetings in the evening. He followed schedules to the minute. Every detail reinforced the Bureau's theory that BTK was a man obsessed with structure. Investigators gathered enough for probable cause but wanted irrefutable proof before making an arrest. The plan centered on DNA, the missing link that could tie his modern identity to the old murders. Detectives remembered reading that Rader had an adult daughter studying in college. With coordination from state authorities, agents obtained a medical swab from her during a routine appointment without revealing its purpose. When the sample reached the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's forensic unit, scientists worked overnight. They compared the daughter's genetic material to the trace evidence preserved from decades-old crime scenes. The results were definitive. The familial match indicated that BTK was almost certainly her father, Dennis Rader. Still, the task force moved cautiously. They built layers of corroboration, vehicle registrations matching reports of a specific Jeep seen near one crime scene, handwriting samples from city documents, and Rader's presence at locations overlapping timelines of the letters. Even his use of language in church agendas contained the same quirks found in BTK correspondence: phrase structures, punctuation patterns, capitalization habits. Every piece fit too perfectly to ignore. Throughout February, command meetings intensified. The fear of tipping him off haunted investigators. They knew that confronting him too soon could provoke unpredictable behavior, perhaps escape, or worse, violence against family. Detectives operated under deep cover, following him to grocery stores and monitoring his movements through discreet GPS tracking. Each observation confirmed their suspicion. Dennis Rader was both perfectly ordinary and monstrously calculating. Back at his house, Rader stayed oblivious. He felt proud that the floppy disk had caused media excitement. Seeing reporters discuss his technical savvy made him smirk. He believed the police had no leads. In diary entries later discovered by officers, he wrote about feeling secure in operations and rated his satisfaction level as very good. Beneath his calm, he relished the illusion of control, unaware that his own question about traceability had already signed his confession. The Wichita task force prepared the arrest warrant quietly. Chief Norman Williams emphasized restraint. "When we move," he told his officers, "we move without risk." Rader's predictability worked in their favor. He left for work at the same time each morning and returned for lunch at noon. Surveillance confirmed the habit for days. They planned to intercept him casually between destinations, away from home or church, where family and congregants would not intervene. As the net closed, fragments of the real Dennis Rader began to surface through recorded conversations and public records. Former neighbors mentioned his fascination with ordinances and how he photographed properties for minor code violations. Church members spoke about his perfectionism, how he once scolded them for misnumbering meeting notes. Every story illustrated the same psychological pattern, a man measuring compliance in everyone around him. To the task force psychiatrist, it perfectly aligned with the behavioral markers of BTK, the need for control, ritual, and validation. Officers revisited the physical evidence one last time. They reopened sealed bags containing traces collected decades earlier, fibers, a long hair from one ligature, a partial DNA sample preserved in cold storage. Each test now matched Rader's family line precisely. The science that did not exist in 1974 had finally caught up. In press briefings, authorities maintained silence. They did not want the suspect to sense the investigation's momentum. Local journalists speculated about new leads but had no details. Meanwhile, Rader continued mailing small pieces of correspondence, savoring what he believed was ongoing dominance. His last 2 packages were intercepted before they reached recipients. Each was labeled with playful cryptograms, one referencing the end of the game. Police interpreted it as both confession and foreshadowing. The weekend before his arrest, detectives followed him through errands, dropping off church flyers, driving to a hardware store, returning home to trim hedges with mechanical precision. They debated whether he sensed anything unusual. He did not. To him, life remained a balanced routine of civic duty and private pride. Looking back later, investigators described the case as solved by a question. If Rader had not asked about the floppy disk, years might still have passed without closure. The irony was complete. After decades of eluding capture through his knowledge of police methods, he was undone by outdated technology and a single moment of arrogance. When officers prepared the final arrest order, Chief Williams called it poetic justice. He lived by control, he said, and control is what he just lost. Within hours, every detail was ready: team assignments, timing, the route of his car. They would move on him during a lunch break, between home and City Hall, ensuring no one else would be endangered. The man who called himself BTK believed he was untouchable. In reality, every movement, every breath, was now catalogued by the same precision he once imposed on his victims. The floppy disk, once his proud upgrade into the digital age, had become the digital trail sealing his fate. In its hidden metadata lay the truth he had guarded for 30 years. Soon, that line of code, Christ, Lutheran Church, author, Dennis, would shift this entire story from rumor to revelation. And as he organized paperwork in his office on February 25, 2005, believing the game with police was still his to manage, unmarked cars waited quietly across Park City. Their radios whispered final instructions. The officers knew they were not just catching a killer. They were about to end a long chapter of Wichita's fear. In the calm before the knock, Dennis Rader still thought he was winning. February 25, 2005. The winter sun hung low over Park City as Dennis Rader left his office for his usual lunch break. He followed the same path he always did, down a narrow suburban street, his white Jeep Cherokee idling quietly at stoplights. He did not notice the unmarked sedans positioned at intersections or the plainclothes officers shadowing him from a distance. For 30 years, he had walked unseen among them, but this time, every move was being watched. As he pulled into a small retail parking lot, a convoy of vehicles closed in. The lead detective stepped forward, badge raised. "Mr. Rader," he said evenly. There was no chase, no chaos. Rader blinked behind his glasses, looked around, and realized exactly what was happening. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone calm but clipped. They told him he was under arrest in connection with the BTK murders. He said nothing. He simply placed his hands behind his back, as if he had rehearsed it. The restraint clicked into place with a sound both ordinary and monumental. Investigators later said The arrest was almost unsettlingly quiet. Neighbors watching from storefronts saw a middle-aged man surrender like he had been expecting the moment. No resistance, no plea, one officer recalled. He looked more annoyed than scared, like we'd interrupted his day. They drove him straight to Wichita Police Headquarters. The car ride stretched in silence. Through the window, the city he had terrorized for decades rolled past. Gas stations, fields, quiet cul-de-sacs. Now it was just scenery. When they arrived, he was escorted upstairs to an interrogation room. Technicians immediately began collecting samples: hair, saliva, skin cells. Within hours, lab analysts confirmed what they already knew. The DNA matched crime scene evidence from 1974. The ghost had a body, a name, and fingerprints again. News of the arrest spread before sunset. Television anchors broke into broadcasts. Reporters scrambled toward Park City, and by evening, the street near his home was lined with media vans. The church president, code officer, and scout leader, revealed as BTK, had been caught. Residents stared at screens in disbelief. Some recognized him instantly from years of mundane encounters. The man who had issued warnings about grass length, who had ushered them to pews at church, who had smiled politely at town meetings. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath everyday reality. Inside headquarters, detectives began searching Rader's Jeep and home. What they found erased any remaining doubt. Hidden compartments contained Polaroids of crime scenes taken by the killer himself. Boxes marked projects held manuscripts detailing each murder, typed, numbered, and annotated with revision notes. In drawers, they found jewelry, driver's licenses, and scraps of clothing belonging to victims. Every souvenir was catalogued with precise labels, like a librarian archiving memories. His suburban home, tidy and predictable, doubled as a museum of horror. When officers informed Chief Norman Williams, his voice reportedly dropped to a whisper. "It's over," he said. "We got BTK." Relief, mixed with disbelief. Rader was not the faceless monster they had imagined. He was one of them, a respected citizen with steady employment, family photos on the mantle, and campaign flyers thanking voters for civic service. The contradiction confounded even seasoned investigators. As news exploded publicly, Park City residents flooded police lines, demanding reassurance. Was it really him? Were they safe now? Detectives confirmed the identification but offered few details. In the following days, search teams combed his home again, removing hundreds of documents. They discovered a handwritten application for church maintenance project funds filed the same week he mailed one of his last BTK packages. The overlap exemplified his seamless split life, planning church repairs by day and plotting taunts to police by night. At the county jail, Rader spent his first night under suicide watch. He requested reading material about criminal law, asked for his glasses, and declined food. Guards described his demeanor as eerily composed. The next morning, detectives Ken Landwehr and Kelly Otis met him in an interview room. They expected denial, maybe bargaining. Instead, Rader greeted them politely, asked for coffee, and began answering questions in small talk before drifting toward the inevitable topic. "How's the investigation team doing?" he asked. "Must have been quite a job tracking me down." Otis said later that his tone carried neither pride nor fear, just curiosity. When they told him the floppy disk had exposed his name, he sighed and nodded. "So, that's it then," he said softly. "The computers got me." That acknowledgement opened the floodgates. Over the next 30 hours, Rader spoke openly, methodically recounting crimes, each described as projects, completed according to plan. Detectives filled notebooks faster than they could process. The same meticulous attitude he brought to his city job now structured his confession. Rader showed no visible emotion when discussing victims, yet between descriptions, he would adjust his glasses and complain about procedural details, how some police interpretations of the letters were inaccurate, and how the press misused certain terminology. It was as though he were editing his own story while under arrest. Meanwhile, his wife Paula was informed privately. Authorities arrived at the family home surrounded by flashing lights. She initially believed there had been a mistake. The man she had lived with for 34 years could not be the monster who haunted Wichita. When detectives explained they had DNA and confession, she collapsed, whispering that she had never suspected anything. That disbelief echoed across the city. Parish members gathered at Christ Lutheran, praying together under news cameras, struggling to reconcile the images. Their kind, organized president and the serial killer, now confessing downtown. By evening, investigative teams continued cataloging evidence. In his basement, they found boxes of index cards filled with notes on each victim. summaries of surveillance, approaches, bindings, and outcomes. Many included phrases such as project successful or good work. To police, it read like a professional log rather than a personal diary. He had referred to his victims by initials or nicknames, erasing their humanity to maintain psychological distance. In the garage lay another trove: maps, splice of cords, and an old Polaroid camera. Everything matched descriptions from decades-old crime scenes. One detective later called the home an archive of evil disguised as ordinary. Outside, reporters caught sight of Rader being transferred from headquarters to county jail. He wore a light jacket against the February cold, expression neutral. Cameras flashed, questions flew. "Are you BTK?" someone shouted. He did not look up. The door closed behind him, ending 30 years of pursuit. Back at headquarters, officers shared quiet disbelief rather than celebration. Many had grown up hearing of BTK. Now they had arrested him. Some stayed late into the night rereading his old letters, realizing how close he had lived to their own neighborhoods. Chief Williams thanked his team but reminded them that for victims' families, closure would not erase pain. "We found the man," he said, "but that does not heal 30 years. In Park City, residents stood outside the Rader home as investigators hauled boxes into evidence vans. The porch light cast calm shadows over the neatly trimmed yard. It looked like any other suburban house, meticulous and symmetrical. That contrast unsettled everyone. One neighbor whispered to a reporter, "He used to wave every morning." At jail intake, Rader listed his occupation as compliance officer. When asked about religion, he wrote Lutheran. Medical intake recorded no signs of stress. A guard later said he spent that first week arranging his cell possessions in straight lines, folding clothes precisely. Even confined, order was his instinct. Within days, prosecutors prepared formal charges, 10 counts of first-degree murder. Each represented lives connected by a pattern finally unmasked. Detectives who had retired returned just to witness the confirmation. For them, the capture was professional closure and personal relief. When they announced the arrest publicly, Chief Williams stepped to the podium and declared, "The man known as BTK is in custody." The room erupted in camera flashes. For Wichita, those words marked the end of a long reign of fear. As Dennis Rader sat in an interrogation room, sipping coffee and discussing his crimes like administrative tasks, the enormity of what the city had endured sank in. 30 years of terror, hidden behind the face of a neighbor. For the first time, Wichita could begin to exhale, though understanding the truth would take far longer. The man they trusted to keep order had built his life on chaos. The counselor, the father, the church leader, revealed finally as the man who bound, tortured, and killed. And as the world learned his name, Dennis Rader smiled faintly, a remnant of the control he no longer possessed. His invisible rule had ended not in a dramatic chase or final crime, but in a quiet arrest on a street he had driven 1,000 times before. In custody, Dennis Rader did not wait for lawyers or pleas. The moment investigators mentioned evidence, he began talking, almost relieved to release what he had kept compartmentalized for decades. He spoke not like a man unburdening guilt, but like an engineer walking auditors through design schematics. Detectives started recording, notebooks filling page after page. For 31 hours spread over 2 days, he detailed 10 murders, each described as a project. He explained how he had chosen victims through observation, calling it scouting. He described patterns, routes, times of day. He presented each murder as a task completed, rather than a life taken. When detectives asked how he selected households, he said, calmly, that some names just sounded interesting. He used the word factor instead of person, and procedure where others would have said attack. Sergeant Landwehr later admitted he felt nauseated by the detachment. Rader traced his history methodically. For the Otero family, he explained entering the home, pretending to need a car or tools, improvising his plan when they resisted. His tone never changed when recounting how the children begged. He merely said, "That presented a problem," before describing his solution in clinical terms. The same pattern unfolded through every case. Calm description, procedural language, no hesitation. When detectives asked what BTK meant to him, Rader leaned back and recited it like a mission slogan: bind them, torture them, kill them. He said the phrase helped him stay organized and reminded him of his purpose. To him, naming was control. The most disturbing details were not the acts themselves, but the tone, flat, factual, almost professional. He measured events in minutes, distances, sequences. One investigator later said, It was like he was reading a manual you did not want written. Each murder followed what he called the code, a personal checklist. Step 1. Secure the environment. Step 2. Bind. Step 3. Photograph trophies. Checkmarks followed every stage. Rader described his victims as projects for my files. In his mind, documentation completed the act. Detectives realized his obsessive record-keeping, so evident at work and church, extended to his killings. Every folder found in his home mirrored his oral timeline. He remembered license numbers, clothing colors, and even the arrangement of furniture decades earlier. When asked how he could recall such precision, he shrugged. "Because I'm organized," he said. Occasionally his composure faltered, but never from remorse. When investigators made transcription mistakes or used incorrect phrasing, he interrupted to correct them. "No, she was in the north bedroom first," he would insist. His concern was accuracy, not empathy. One detective compared it to interviewing a factory inspector evaluating inefficiencies. The only emotion came when control slipped. At one point, they asked why he had stopped after 1991. His answer was plain. Life got busier, responsibilities grew, opportunities fewer. "You cannot do projects when people expect you home," he said. He did not claim reform, just lack of time. When asked why he restarted communications in 2004, he admitted irritation that people forgot him. "I'm proud of my work," he said. "I wanted credit." That line silenced the room. Investigators pressed whether he understood the magnitude of his crimes. Rader nodded matter-of-factly. "They're dead because I wanted them dead." It was the closest he came to acknowledging agency. Yet he insisted on framing each murder as a structured event rather than violence. Every sentence returned to procedure. For emotional perspective, detectives later invited him to read prepared statements from victims' relatives. He listened politely, but without visible response. When one father's note mentioned the smell of his daughter's old perfume still haunting their house, Rader blinked and calmly asked if the statement would become evidence. To the detectives, the divide between morality and order in his mind was absolute. Behind the two-way glass, officers observing the interview struggled to maintain composure. Some had worked the original Otero scene. They watched him describe minute details that matched their memories precisely, proof of authenticity and a reminder of trauma. Later that night, Sergeant Landwehr stepped outside to smoke, telling a younger officer, "He remembers it like a hobby. We remember it like nightmares." Day 2 of interrogation deepened the paradox. He volunteered more details without prompting: where he parked, how he disguised his car, which neighbors nearly saw him. He smiled faintly, recalling how police patrols once drove by unaware. "I saw them coming," he said. "Timing is everything if you plan right." Those words captured the essence of Dennis Rader, a man who equated murder with scheduling. As he continued, detectives noticed subtle pride in his storytelling. When he listed obstacles overcome, a barking dog, a locked door, he smiled as if describing triumphs in a technical challenge. Each murder was treated as problem-solving rather than tragedy. When one investigator asked if he ever felt empathy during killings, Rader paused only to adjust his glasses before answering. "Not then," he said. "That kind of feeling would get in the way." His emphasis on control surfaced repeatedly. He contrasted his organized projects with what he called messy killers. He considered himself disciplined, professional, even courteous. He claimed he sometimes apologized to victims before restraining them to appear polite. That dissonance, gentle manner overlaying brutality, astounded listeners. Between sessions, Rader requested small comforts: water with ice, a pen of his own choosing, and updates on whether detectives were filing chronologically. Landwehr allowed minor indulgences, understanding that keeping him comfortable ensured more disclosure. The recordings captured hours of unemotional narration: dates, addresses, materials used, followed by detached pauses. Prosecutors reviewed transcripts in disbelief. His self-description aligned perfectly with behavioral profiles written decades earlier. He fit the prediction of an organized, rational offender who compartmentalized daily life completely. What psychology texts debated in theory now sat across from them, arranging his coffee cup symmetrically before speaking. That mechanical precision disturbed investigators more than rage would have. Rader's killings were not impulsive. They were calculated expressions of ego. Each pause, each methodical explanation, turned confession into demonstration. When asked if he prayed afterward, he nodded. "Always," he said, then added, almost cheerfully, "I ask forgiveness. Then I log the project." The term log underscored everything they had learned: control as faith, crime as chore, confession as management. He even compared his documentation to archival work at church meetings, saying, "I like keeping records straight. God likes order." Detectives stared at him, unsure whether the remark was delusion or justification. The sessions culminated with Rader outlining how he balanced dual identities. He described shifting masks, explaining that he saw BTK as a role he entered, Dennis as the everyday self that earned trust. "They never mixed," he said proudly. "That's good compartmentalization." Psychologists later used that phrase to describe pathological disassociation, the ability to perform atrocities while preserving normal social function. After 30 hours, he showed no fatigue. When officers told him questioning was complete, he appeared momentarily disappointed. "Do not you need clarifications?" he asked. Landwehr assured him the record was exhaustive. He nodded, satisfied, and offered to draw diagrams for better understanding. When they brought him paperwork for formal confession, he read every word carefully, correcting minor typographical errors before signing. His penmanship was deliberate, identical to his meticulous church notes. He signed both Dennis Rader and BTK, explaining it should be consistent. That moment symbolized the joining of masks, the civic man and the killer, occupying one line at last. News of his detailed admissions stunned the city. Reporters covering the case described it as the most chilling debrief they had ever heard. Excerpts read in pretrial documents revealed his emotional emptiness and pride in organization. Psychiatrists later summarized him as a man of form without feeling. For victims' families, the confession reopened wounds but answered questions left unspoken for decades. They finally learned their loved ones had not known their killer, had not provoked him, had not failed in some unforeseen way. They were simply victims of a man who saw people as lines on a list. After the sessions ended, Rader was transported back to his cell. He asked guards to ensure his written materials were alphabetized and requested a Bible to read chronologically. The irony was not lost on them. Even in confinement, his instinct was structure. The detectives left the interrogation rooms exhausted and hollow. One of them summarized it quietly as he turned off the recorder. He was not confessing to relieve guilt. He was confessing to complete the record. Those words captured Dennis Rader perfectly. A man whose obsession with order outlived empathy, whose final act of control was to document his own destruction. The announcement of Dennis Rader's guilt plea sent waves through Kansas and beyond. The case that had haunted Wichita for 3 decades was now open in court, and the man who had signed every tormenting letter with BTK was finally ready to take the stand. Yet nothing about the proceeding resembled standard justice theater. Rader was not fighting charges or searching for sympathy. He wanted recognition. From the beginning, his cooperation was conditional on control. Prosecutors agreed to skip a prolonged trial if he provided full disclosure before sentencing. It spared victims' families from testimony battles, though it meant they would still hear the killer's version of events in his own voice. On June 27, 2005, the courtroom filled to capacity, jurors dismissed, cameras arranged quietly at the back. Every bench was taken by relatives of victims, police officers, reporters, and citizens who had lived under the shadow of BTK for much of their lives. When Rader entered, wearing an ill-fitting beige suit, the room froze. There were no shackles visible. He greeted guards with polite nods, adjusted his glasses, and placed a folder neatly on the table. He looked like a retiree preparing for a council meeting. Once sworn in, Judge Gregory Waller asked softly, "Mr. Rader, how do you plead?" His answer was as crisp as his tie. "Guilty, Your Honor." The judge required detailed confirmation, a procedural safeguard to ensure competence and understanding. What followed stunned even seasoned court staff. Asked to describe what made him guilty, Rader began recounting each of the 10 murders in clinical narrative. No visible tremor crossed his face as he outlined how he had pre-planned, secured bindings, and terminated projects. He spoke for over 2 hours, walking through each case as methodically as if reviewing a maintenance checklist. Viewers watching live saw reporters lower their pens in disbelief. Families in the gallery clutched one another tightly, some leaving mid-testimony. When describing the Otero murders, Rader misspoke, calling one child by the wrong name, then corrected himself calmly. "No, that was Joseph Jr., not Josephine," he said, as if amending minutes from a meeting. The judge stopped him several times, struggling to balance formality with compassion. "Mr. Rader, you are not required to go into detail," Waller said. Rader replied gently, "I understand, sir, but it is part of the record." Outside the courthouse, Wichita gathered in collective disbelief. News stations broadcast his monotone explanations, and callers flooded talk shows, trying to process how someone so mild could harbour such calculation. Parish members from Christ Lutheran gave interviews through tears. "He was our friend," a councilwoman said, voice breaking. "He fixed the lock on the nursery door." Inside police headquarters, detectives watched the televised plea from a briefing room. They had known the facts for months, yet hearing them spoken publicly still hit hard. Landwehr, who had chased BTK for half his career, described it later. "He told our whole story back to us, like he had been the narrator the entire time." Prosecutors kept expressions neutral. For them, the hearing was closure in progress. Assistant District Attorney Kevin O'Connor opened the sentencing phase by reading summaries from each victim's relative. One by one, family members stepped forward to speak, facing the man who had devastated their lives. Their voices filled the courtroom with trembling strength. A brother described years of nightmares, a daughter spoke about growing up fatherless, a mother called Rader a coward hiding behind civility. Throughout it all, he listened silently, hands folded. Occasionally he nodded, not in remorse but in acknowledgement, as if confirming meeting points. When one father challenged him directly, "Look at me when I speak about my son," Rader complied, eyes steady and blank. Observers said the absence of emotion was more terrifying than rage could ever be. The prosecution presented physical evidence confirming his guilt beyond doubt. Photographs of hidden boxes, typed confessions, DNA matches, and diaries appeared on screens. Each new slide erased speculation that someone else could have shared responsibility. Rader had acted entirely alone, guided only by his compulsion and his fascination with control. When defense counsel addressed the court, there was little to argue. Their plea was administrative, that Rader fully understood punishment and wanted the record accurate. The court psychiatrist's brief assessment confirmed no legal insanity, only narcissistic personality traits amplified by obsession. In legal terms, he was culpable. Public fascination with the trial approached national obsession. Networks replayed excerpts of his statement nightly. Newspapers printed long analyses of his psychological makeup, contrasting the sharp-dressed churchman with the detached confessor. Discussion boards debated how such duality could exist. For Wichita, it revived ancient anxiety, even while offering closure. People drove by his former house hesitantly, as if to see proof that evil could occupy such plain ground. Journalists interviewed his co-workers at ADT, who remembered how he documented every job with photographs. The eerie overlap between those procedural snapshots and his crime documentation fascinated criminologists. Some noted that his confession taught investigators as much about administrative pathology as criminality. Rader did not kill out of compulsion alone. He required record-keeping to validate identity. Without documentation, he did not exist. In the days leading to sentencing, analysis programs dissected his courtroom demeanor. Experts debated whether his calm signified emotional absence or deliberate performance. Former FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood remarked in an interview, "He enjoyed being the lecturer again. Control for him means defining the narrative." Others saw frailty, a man aged by confinement realizing the myth had ended. When sentencing day arrived on August 18, 2005, the courthouse overflowed again. Victims' families filled the front rows, law enforcement the next, and media crews lined the walls. Rader entered, with slight stiffness, offering faint smiles at the guards who escorted him. Before the judge read his punishment, he requested to make a statement. For nearly 20 minutes, he delivered what sounded like a strange sermon, a mixture of apology, self-analysis, and procedural review. He thanked law enforcement for their professionalism, apologized if any of the families were hurt, and referenced God's ultimate judgment as the official audit. Listeners shifted uneasily at the bureaucratic language. He concluded with, "I know my punishment is deserved. The record is complete." Judge Waller leaned forward, expression hardening. "Mr. Rader," he said, "your conduct was indescribable. The words evil and selfish are inadequate. You have left behind more victims than those slain, wives without husbands, children without parents, a community without peace." He sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms without parole, 405 years before eligibility. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief. Families wept openly. Officers embraced. As deputies prepared to lead him away, Rader adjusted his glasses once more, nodded toward prosecutors, and said softly, "Thank you for your fairness." It was an astonishing parting line, revealing a man still believing in order even as that order dismantled him. Outside, the crowd of hundreds gathered under the summer sun broke into applause when the life sentences were confirmed. Police officers who had carried guilt over unsolved years stood together silently, feeling the chapter close at last. News coverage called it Wichita's Day of Catharsis. In the following weeks, the city tried to process what closure truly meant. Churches held vigils not for the killer, but for communal healing. Sermons focused on resilience and vigilance. Psychologists offered counseling to residents who had lived decades in precaution. Locking doors again, even without reason, remains habit. One counselor noted, the fear had left scars deeper than awareness admitted. Rader's family retreated from public life. His wife filed for divorce immediately after the plea, citing emotional trauma. His daughter issued a brief letter expressing heartbreak, but also sympathy for the victims. Wichita responded with compassion toward them, recognizing they too were casualties of deception. For reporters, covering the sentencing ended one of Kansas's longest-running stories. Yet even in closure, fascination persisted. Academics studied his communications, using them as case material in criminology and behavioral psychology. Textbooks began referring to his correspondence as the Rader files, proof of organized seriality evolving within ordinary life. Law enforcement agencies nationwide re-examined unsolved serial cases, emphasizing preservation of digital evidence. The metadata on Rader's floppy disk became legendary among forensic teams, a warning that ego leaves fingerprints more permanent than DNA. Back in Sedgwick County Jail, denied further interviews, Rader spent his days cataloging books in the prison library. Guards reported he arranged shelves alphabetically and filed requests for revised checkout policies. Even there, control defined existence. For Wichita, however, control returned to the community. Streets, once haunted by uncertainty, regained quiet. Children played outside again. Neighbors waved without fear. When television documentaries revisited the case later, many residents declined to participate. They preferred memory's slow fade over re-traumatization. Detective Landwehr, speaking years after retirement, summarized the journey plainly. He hid because he looked like us. We caught him because he thought he was smarter than us. In the end, arrogance is what confesses. The story of Dennis Rader's trial was not only about crime or justice. It was about how a city reclaimed its narrative from someone who believed he owned it. When the cell door finally shut behind him, Wichita did not cheer for punishment. It exhaled after 3 decades of holding its breath. For the first time since 1974, the community could tell its children not a warning, but an ending. The man who called himself BTK was gone, and he was never coming back. For Wichita, the months following Dennis Rader's sentencing felt strangely still. The noise of media coverage faded, replaced by the everyday hum of ordinary life. Yet under that quiet, the community carried the weight of knowledge that the man who had terrorized them for decades had lived among them as a neighbor, a church president, and a father. The relief of closure mixed with confusion. Many residents could not decide which was more frightening, the murders themselves or the mask that had hidden them. City leaders organized memorials for the victims, planting trees at local parks in their memory. Families gathered with candles and photographs, speaking softly about lives interrupted but never erased. Each name represented years of absence finally acknowledged. For parents who had once warned their children about BTK as a shadowy monster, it was jarring to discover that the monster had been a familiar face holding clipboards and quoting city codes. The lesson was unsettlingly simple. Evil can be ordinary, thorough, polite. Reporters looking back on the investigation traced its ripple effects through every department involved. Advances born from failure reshaped policing across Kansas. The use of preserved evidence and digital forensics became standard procedure. Detectives who had once stored files in cardboard boxes now archived them in secure databases. The case that had outlasted generations of investigators turned into a blueprint for modern cold case strategy. The role of forensic science changed most visibly. The DNA match that confirmed Rader's guilt was among the earliest high-profile examples of familial DNA identification. Laboratories across the country adopted similar techniques soon after. In law enforcement conferences, specialists referred to BTK not only as a crime case but as a turning point for technology, the moment when silence could no longer protect a killer from evidence preserved long before. Criminologists saw other lessons in Rader's double life. His seamless balance between public virtue and hidden cruelty forced psychologists to reconsider diagnostic assumptions. Traditional models of serial behavior emphasized social isolation or early dysfunction. Rader defied those projections. He attended meetings, raised children, performed administrative work with precision. The absence of visible chaos made him uniquely dangerous. Researchers began discussing compartmentalized offenders, individuals who construct entire frameworks of routine to mask deviance. His name appeared in criminology textbooks beside theories on narcissistic control and behavioral organization. For victims' families, academic discussions felt distant. Their focus turned to rebuilding lives interrupted by decades of not knowing. Many formed advocacy groups supporting victims of unsolved crimes. They pushed for funding of cold case units and DNA databanks, believing that if technology had existed earlier, the killings might have stopped sooner. Some families attended lectures on forensic advancement, turning grief into activism. Their message was consistent: awareness saves lives. Within Wichita, efforts to restore trust unfolded quietly. Church congregations examined internal practices for protecting members. Civic offices reviewed hiring and psychological screening procedures. Residents found comfort in small gestures. Neighborhood cleanups, block parties, shared remembrance events. A sense of communal vigilance replaced collective fear. People watched out for one another, not with paranoia, but with renewed accountability. Local journalists reflected on their own roles. Many admitted that balancing coverage with restraint had been agonizing. Rader's letters, deliberately designed for publication, had forced ethical dilemmas about attention and responsibility. In later interviews, editors said they learned that transparency must include compassion, that sensationalism risks amplifying the voice of perpetrators over victims. The Wichita Eagle eventually curated an exhibition focused entirely on those who were lost, excluding Rader's imagery altogether. It drew thousands of visitors, including detectives who had once read his taunts in despair. Far from the commotion, Dennis Rader adapted to incarceration with the same mechanical discipline that defined his life outside. At El Dorado Correctional Facility, he organized his small cell meticulously. Guards noted how he arranged books alphabetically, timed his routines, and kept journals under strict headings like daily reflections and upcoming tasks. His correspondence was monitored, yet he continued writing about control, describing prison regulations as another system to master. Psychiatric evaluations reported limited remorse and persistent self-focus. He viewed imprisonment as structure rather than punishment. Occasionally, Rader granted approved interviews for criminological research. His responses were composed, sometimes pedantic. When asked why people still studied him, he answered, "Because I'm organized, and organized offenders make better reading." The bluntness disgusted many, but fascinated behavioral scientists searching for patterns in order-driven pathology. Each publication widened the uncomfortable legacy, knowledge gained through horror. Outside prison walls, Wichita commemorated its survival differently. Schools integrated discussions on safety and civility into curricula. Teachers reminded students that kindness and vigilance coexist. A city once defined by fear aimed to redefine itself through resilience. Murals celebrating community pride appeared downtown. Civic volunteers painted one near the courthouse, depicting birds rising over the skyline. Embedded in the mural was a simple inscription: "We remember, and we go on." For police officers who had inherited the unsolved case only to see it end, the aftermath carried emotional complexity. Some felt triumph, others emptiness. Detective Landwehr retired 2 years later, insisting he wanted Wichita remembered not for BTK, but for perseverance. "He's confined forever," he told reporters, "but this city learned how to adapt." His words resonated more deeply than celebratory headlines. Nationally, the case continued influencing profiling methods. Training academies used it to demonstrate how offenders exploit normalcy and authority positions. The duality of Rader's life, church president and serial killer, became an archetype in criminal psychology lectures. Students studied his communications to understand manipulation of media and investigators. In this strange way, his failures contributed to the prevention of future ones. The cultural fascination, however, never disappeared entirely. Documentaries, podcasts, and films revisited the story repeatedly. Producers often sought permission from victims' families, some of whom declined to participate, preferring quiet remembrance. Others cooperated to ensure accuracy, emphasizing that revisiting history could serve education rather than spectacle. Through those retellings, Wichita's tragedy transformed into collective cautionary memory, a narrative about the unseen capacities of deceit. In personal spaces, survivors continued ordinary lives, shadowed by fragments of fear. Many still locked doors reflexively or flinched at sudden headlines. Yet, they also shared moments of renewed freedom, children walking safely to school, neighbors rebuilding connections once severed by suspicion. The legacy of BTK was paradoxical, proof of human darkness alongside evidence of communal endurance. Years after the sentencing, a journalist visited the now quiet Rader home in Park City. The lawn still trimmed evenly, the porch light replaced but working. A new family lived there, unaware of every camera that had once stood outside. When asked what it felt like to inhabit the former house of a notorious killer, the homeowner replied, "It's just a home to us now. We made it ours." That comment captured Wichita's broader recovery, the transformation of dread into ownership of normalcy again. In scholarly circles, researchers debated the concept of the banality of evil, long tied to bureaucratic atrocities. Rader's name became a modern embodiment of the phrase. His crimes showed how method, rather than passion, could produce devastation. Control, unchecked by empathy, proved as lethal as rage. Those reflections entered ethics courses far beyond criminology, stretching into theology, sociology, and political science. For the people directly touched by the case, the abstract meant little. Their solace lay in knowing the city no longer lived under threat. Memorial gatherings evolved into community celebrations, emphasizing compassion over horror. Streets once described as haunted became symbols of endurance. And inside his cell, Dennis Rader continued to write, drafting lists of daily chores, cataloguing reading progress, noting prison maintenance issues. In one confiscated notebook, he labeled a section, Project's Life Phase 2. Guards found it chilling yet predictable. Even stripped of freedom, he sought structure, proving that for him, control was identity. Wichita, by contrast, had learned that control could also heal. Through collective memory and vigilance, the city rebuilt trust in both law enforcement and one another. The legacy of BTK was not confined to fear, but embedded in the renewed commitment to responsibility. The simple awareness that evil can wear a friendly expression, and that ordinary people together can confront it. In the end, Dennis Rader's story stood not as the tale of a genius criminal, but as the caution of an obsession with order detached from conscience. The city he had once terrorized refused to let that define its spirit. From candlelit vigils to courthouse murals, Wichita rewrote its identity, a place that looked horror in the eye and chose compassion in return. In the quiet of his cell at El Dorado Correctional Facility, Dennis Rader sits at a narrow desk under flickering fluorescent light. On a lined sheet of paper, he draws tidy boxes, labeling them daily schedule, maintenance, and reflections. To guards passing by, it looks harmless, a middle-aged inmate keeping notes, but the system is familiar. Every column echoes the format he once used for projects. Even now, the need for order never fades. He studies the lists with the same detached concentration that once guided his crimes, as though control itself were the only rhythm he recognizes. Outside those walls, Wichita has resumed breathing. The streets he surveyed, the churches he led, all function without him. Children born after his arrest play in front yards once shadowed by fear, yet his story lingers as a reminder that danger does not always announce itself in chaos. Sometimes it organizes meetings, folds bulletins, and mows lawns on Saturdays. That contradiction remains the part hardest to understand, that devotion and destruction could share the same steady hands. Psychologists reviewing the case often describe Rader as the embodiment of ordinary evil. He was not driven by poverty, vengeance, or ideology. He was driven by the desire to manage, to prove superiority through method. The uniform of authority, a church badge, a city emblem, a clipboard, became camouflage for obsession. His victims were not chosen for who they were, but for how easily they fit into his system of order. To him, life was a series of boxes to organize, and people, tragically, were tasks to complete. The lesson his case leaves behind is both moral and institutional. For investigators, it is proof that precision leaves traces. Every record, every digital echo can one day testify. For communities, it is a warning about complacency. Normalcy is not always safety. The idea that a respected church president could also be Wichita's phantom forced people to reconsider what trust looks like. It changed how police profile, how neighborhoods communicate, and how society defines the word monster. Families of the victims continue to honor the names lost, choosing remembrance without spectacle. They tell future generations that vigilance means empathy, not suspicion. That confronting cruelty begins with compassion strong enough to recognize humanity, even when evil hides behind it. Wichita's recovery became its justice, rebuilding meaning from the wreckage of deception. Inside his cell, Rader folds his paper neatly and slides it into a folder marked personal files. It is another false sense of control, a routine pretending to bring order to a life defined by disorder. Time stretches ahead of him in measured sequence, lights on, lights off, day after identical day. Beyond the bars, A city once terrorized by his need for structure now thrives precisely because it learned to live without him. That is the final truth of Dennis Rader, the man who mistook control for purpose and found that, in the end, structure without conscience is only emptiness.